Hello and welcome to Simplified. My name is Gurjot
And my name is Michael.
and this is episode 5.
In this episode, you spoke to David Bresch, a professor of environmental system science here at ETH Zurich. Tell me, what did you learn?
David Bresch is the guy who tells the government how to deal with climate change. He works in weather risk management and does something called reinsurance.
Reinsurance.
Yeah, do you know what that is?
No idea.
Good, he tells us what it is.
So let's find out.
Let's find out. Dr. Bresch, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, pleasure.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where do you do your education? What got you into what you're doing now?
Yeah, what really got me here is probably my intrinsic motivation to look deeper into things and to try and understand how things come about.
Yes.
And at least as much so what people do.
Okay.
The things that come about, and that's more specifically talk about weather and climate.
All right.
And definitely also coming from the notion that what affects people is not so much climate, it's basically weather. It's single events.
Yes.
It's their daily lives that are affected by vagaries, you could say.
Could you
weather
quickly
events.
distinguish between weather and climate?
Basically, the simple thing is that climate is nothing else but weather averaged or looked at over longer time scales.
Yes.
So that's how we probably would talk about, and often the reference period is something like 30 years.
And weather is more day to day. If it's rainy today and sunny tomorrow, then
Yeah.
that's weather.
Yeah, basically, this in the sense that what affects people in a way that also is relevant in their decision making is mainly single events.
Yes.
Is it raining tomorrow? Do I have to prepare for that?
Yes.
Is the next couple days a good time to harvest? That's kind of the
Yes.
questions you ask.
Yes.
And then they are seen and influenced in a climatic context. But that's where we're coming from. So, but my background is in physics. So I studied physics at ETH,
All right.
and then did my PhD here in atmospheric dynamics. Then I worked at MIT in science and policy of climate change.
Okay.
And in fact, it was not so much the science part. I was digging deeper there, but getting more closer to the policy side and saying
All right.
what does really influence people's decisions and what's the frame or the framing they put around the way
Yes.
they decide about things.
Okay. So, what motivated you into moving away from actual gathering data and making models in science to focusing more on the way policy works and decision making works? And what motivated you to move that way?
I think one element was the abundance of information nowadays,
Yes.
and then a bit an element of, you could say, just an easiness or understanding, trying to better understand why some of that information is not properly used, not used as it might be used at best.
Yes.
And one element in that conversation or that understanding was also that I was of the opinion that we know a lot about the weather and climate system,
Yes.
but some of the decisions we take, be it on a long term on the investment side, be it on priorities for one or the other kind of energy and how we deal with these issues,
Yes.
I felt there's a gap that needs to be filled.
Okay.
And it's probably a translation that needs to be done. So it's not that people taking decisions because they would not, they would kind of push this information aside, but it might not come in a form that is directly relevant to their decisions.
Yes.
So talking about, for example, weather extremes, if they happen, people are obviously immediately aware of things,
Yes.
but in planning, things often get overlooked, lost, forgotten,
Yes.
just because the recent past hasn't been showing these things. And so people build in a floodplain, even so they could know better.
Yes.
And somebody would probably even know better. And then it's a question, why aren't these processes happening? We know how weather events come about. We basically know also the climatic conditions for them to develop and ultimately also impact society.
Yes.
But then on the societal level, people are more interested in system performance, I might say. So how do I run my business? How do I design and operate my infrastructure now on the public side?
Okay.
And it's really this interest to close that gap by basically providing the tools ultimately to take better decisions. Really means making sure weather and climate information is adequately used in decision making. That's the goal.
Okay.
And there are some research questions on the more technical side. So how should one decide these decision support systems such that they are exactly leading into that direction?
Okay.
And on the other hand, more on a could say a societal, sociological, and sometimes psychological level, what does it need in a kind of a managerial sense as conditions for these systems to be optimally used? So
Okay.
what are the decision-making processes that should, for example, take better notice of weather and climate information?
Okay, so if I understand correctly, it's essentially climate and atmospheric science combined with some risk analysis, combined with some more policy and sociological decision making.
Yeah, and you could basically say the decision making will mainly happen in very specific context, where you say, take a specific business sector. How could that sector improve its performance by taking this information into account?
Yes.
And often risk is kind of an obvious lens to look at. But risk for me is not so much the downside, it's just an uncertain outcome.
Okay.
So risk is a probability of something being hit,
Yes.
and how badly is it hit in a negative sense, or how high the opportunity might be in a case weather manifests itself in this or the other shape.
Okay.
So it comes really in that very almost holistic sense to say how I'm going to fare under certain conditions,
Okay.
and can I do something about that?
Okay.
Yeah.
So as a science communicator to policy and decision makers, I'm assuming around the world, and what exactly does your job entail? Like in as simple words as possible, what do you do?
It's really to bring the vast body of evidence. We have take IPCC, the
Yes.
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's more the climatic side,
Yes.
or take weather information from weather services such as MeteoSwiss.
Yes.
How is that body of evidence really practically used?
Okay.
And policy is an element in that people do have the frame in which they're using this information, but then it's also to very practically link the decision support systems
Okay.
with that information. That could, for example, mean that people would directly link up to MeteoSwiss
All right.
and use that information, for example, via the app,
Okay.
as recently.
Yes.
Or it could be for a commercial decision maker that they would basically regularly download some of the high resolution weather prediction models and directly link that to the way, for example, they're managing their logistics fleet
Yes.
and how they best allocate their resources to cope with the vagaries of weather.
Okay. So are you also approached directly by, say, the government or some other international bodies working in this area to help them make better decisions?
Yeah,
keeping
I mean
regard climate and
that's
weather
one
analysis?
of the reasons why I also joined ETH again after more than 16 years in industry.
Yes.
Is that I've worked with many stakeholders on the ground in case studies, namely,
Okay.
and sometimes then also in the solution space, providing the risk transfer solutions, some of the things they're doing. And in
Okay.
that context, exactly, it was pretty much a very engaged stakeholder dialogue I've been leading.
All right. So has there been any notable success with regard to such efforts?
I mean, there are many. Number one is just the awareness. So in all these studies, you could say afterwards, people really knew about the issues.
Okay.
And exactly that first part of the gap has been closed, that people
Yes.
would then, after studies, knew, aha, that's the specific risks in my region. And again, risks and opportunities in
Yes.
this sense, I could further work on.
Okay.
These studies always provided people with a basket of adaptation options to better manage their risks and better harvest their opportunities. In many places, if you take the case in Maharashtra in India, where people figured, aha, if you do better soil management, you switch to drip irrigation, and you probably also think about which crop fares best in these environments. Independent of climatic change, you can continue to basically manage the agricultural sector in Maharashtra and India. It doesn't come for free, so that was often the problem, that that it needs investment. It needs investment also over time. It needs maintenance.
Yes.
But that only can happen if the awareness is there and the opportunities and the options are on the table. So that we achieved in most places with these studies.
Okay.
And in few places we also went into the implementation phase of things.
All right.
The case I mentioned in Maharashtra was not so much us.
Mm-hmm.
The mandate for the study was just to understand the situation and provide the options.
And was this initiated by the Indian government or
Jointly. Most of these studies were serving a need or responding to a request from a specific region. Could somebody look into more deeply how we could better manage weather and climate risks?
Okay.
But then it was normally in a joint effort with be it World Bank, the German Development Bank, the Caribbean Cat Risk Insurance Facility, for example, or the Asian Development Bank. And these partners then, together with us more on the scientific side, looked deeply into these issues. And there are places when we've done the study after Sandy in New York, where we really led to a 16 billion investment plan. So there, it's very specific. Bloomberg took it not even a year after Sandy and said, these are the things we're going to strengthen the resiliency of downtown Manhattan.
Yes.
And so in some places it was very specific.
Yes.
In others it was more geared at better understanding the system, and most studies were somewhere in between. So some of the elements have by now been implemented. And the last example is San Salvador, where we've done the study last year.
Okay.
And there I'm now working with the local university in taking the same approach to other regions of the city. So they basically embrace the methodology in order to better understand the situation.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. So, more generally, how do you think countries deal economically and politically with climate change, given how it can be classified as a manufactured risk? Because we have no idea how to deal with it because there's no precedent. We have nothing to look up to or look behind at.
Yeah, in a more general sense, I've been deeply involved in the new climate economy with their seminal report, Better Growth, Better Climate. And the interesting piece is growth or development comes first. And climate is the condition under which this development is happening.
Yes.
And pretty much there's also the notion, yes, it's true, some of those who manufactured the problem, so to say, the top emitters, are not the ones worst hit from first hand.
Yes.
So there's an element of justice that needs to be observed in that.
Okay.
But you also realize in that report that many places, not so highly developed yet, have a tremendous opportunity to go into the resilient development path. That means to develop in a fashion that does take in account the changing level of risk. But even better so, they should target and can target a climate compatible growth pathway, where you basically say, I do not need to emit as much carbon to get to a position where my society is prospering.
Yes.
So I could think about other means of technology, especially renewables, to fuel growth, so to say, rather than to go with the kind of the high carbon emissions way.
Okay. And so we talked about looking at carbon emissions. So with regards to individual versus industry, where does investing the effort make more sense? You could have an entire neighborhood change their incandescent light bulbs to LED. I think that would make just as much effect as much just changing one industry's carbon filters would.
Yeah.
So
I think it's if we're too far into the game, you might say, or too deep into the problem to have an either-or conversation. It's both. You need both. You desperately, in fact, need both. You need both the utmost effort on the individual side, not least because it also changes people's minds.
yes.
But you need, and there probably you need also quite some effort on the policy side to make sure you level the play field on the industrial side and you do not basically export your high carbon emitting part and then import the goods.
Yes.
And because there's some embedded carbon that sticks to these goods, and so you should better manage that in a comprehensive fashion.
Yes. So I can talk from an Indian perspective where the narrative has always been about an individual effort, change your LED bulbs, save water, but never so much on the industry. Is it? Have you seen the same thing happen across the world, or?
Yeah, it's a bit also, and I think it's a very it's a complex issue. Number one, yes, but there is also an element of unfairness to blame the individual for everything.
Yes.
It's true. especially in the more liberal and democratic societies, people do take their own decisions.
Yes.
And it should be like this. But they take these decisions in a societal context, and they can change that through the way they vote, through the things develop. But that's not. It's not a simple thing, to say the least. And therefore, you need policy to frame the environment such that people can take decisions to their own advantage, which should also contribute to the greater good. And that needs to be structured like that. It's too easy to say change a light bulb and that's changing the world. It's a tiny contribution. It should not be neglected and should not be played down.
Yes.
But if the wider environment is not conducive, so if the power that powers your light bulb is still coal,
yes,
it doesn't make any difference.
Yes.
And so the point is how you bring that. Think about India bring it to the more solar, bring it to some of the hydropower that's there already.
Yes.
I've been not that close, only in some parts, and then you realize it's really deep questions. It's deep questions. Do you rather want as a society to develop a bit slower, but in a much more sustainable fashion, with much more long-term benefits?
Yes.
And normally people agree to that if you allow them to speak up. And that's an element I do see, especially in India, a tremendous opportunity. It's a democratic country.
Yes.
And so these voices have a stronger, or it's still easier to voice these concerns in such an environment than in others.
Yes.
And therefore, I think people do agree, and over time probably would also understand that little bit the slower pace with much more sustainable an outcome is the better option.
Indeed. And so, as a climate scientist, so how do you deal with the scenario where gathering real data from satellites or weather balloons or any other equipment is just as difficult as building a simulation model? So, how do you possibly deal with both your variables?
Yeah, it's a very good question in the sense that some people think as long as you don't have perfect data, it's very hard to consult, for example, to provide facts and figures that help decision making. But I've come across kind of the other way around.
Okay.
So normally, the biggest challenge is to rally support for people to really look into the issues, whatever data might be available already now.
Okay.
So it's more. I often try to frame the problem more from the side, what are the options we can take? And that has a lot to do with co-development and co-creation of opportunities with, say, a community. And then to ask, what are the boundary conditions under which these options work? And that's the moment where you need some data.
Yes.
But then you sometimes realize there are options you can easily reject because they have too many externalities, for example. Or there are other options where it does matter to know weather and climate parameters, but only you need to know them so well.
Yes.
So, for example, you might say switching to drip irrigation, it's just a wise decision because you need less water for the same amount of output.
Yes.
You even have some fewer issues with soil degradation. And so some of these things, you need to know, is there still some precipitation coming down, but the exact amount, you become to some extent resilient against that threat by switching to that technology. So that switching technology is not dependent on the satellite.
Yes.
It's more dependent on your willingness now as a community to move. And that's much more you're asking from people.
Yes.
The other thing where satellites do come in is when you think about weather insurance. So there will be events where there is just not enough rain.
Yes.
And now you could either say that's the moment, where it gets harsh, but you could also say it might make a lot of sense to provide people with some financial compensation in such an event. And there, for example, using not an indemnity-based insurance, so people have to say, I couldn't harvest, there was not much they could get from the ground, but rather to say, no, the satellite showed that this pixel was brown, so people could not, in fact, do any farming, and they would therefore be compensated for that lack of an income. For these type of arrangements, you need satellites, and that's something we've seen tremendous progress over the last years in microinsurance and what we call parametric insurance products, where people basically get reimbursed based on a physical trigger
Okay.
which is much faster often the payout than if they have to wait for a loss adjuster to walk by their field and figure, was that just lazy farming or was it just a lack of rain?
Yes. So does this kind of insurance work better than life insurance generally does? Because from what we know, life insurance companies always try to wiggle their way out of it. Does it work?
That's a very good remark. I mean, that's the exact reason that why you go for this type of parametric solutions, because the payout is linked to a physical parameter you can measure.
Yes.
And so you can not so easily trick the satellite.
Yes.
Well, while with other forms of insurance, there's a lot of moral hazard.
Yes.
But either both sides. The policyholder might basically rig an event that he gets a payout, or the insurer might just walk away with the money. And so basically both things can happen, and that's why there's tremendous moral hazard in some of the insurance solutions you do find. While for the parametric side, where it's a physically measured property, it's much harder to argue.
Yes. And you talked about how individual effort is very important in trying to deal with such risks. Have you faced problems with bringing about individual change because of lobbying, perhaps, or other big players trying to not make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, when we've been setting up these case studies, we've put a lot of an effort at the beginning in a very rigorous stakeholder analysis.
Okay.
To make sure all the relevant groups are at the table.
All right.
And it often took us, you could say, more time and energy to make that one happen than later the studying and the research itself.
Okay.
And it's really difficult because you do not get a lot of recognition for making that first step and this crucial step happen.
Yes.
But all you do afterwards is absolutely crucially dependent on that first step of gathering people. And sometimes you have to work over time that people start to understand there's a shared interest, probably even there's a shared common goal.
Yes.
And to develop the process towards this common goal, one should not underestimate, the effort one has to put into that. On the other hand, people do usually not only realize but also acknowledge the fact that it's worth spending a time on first agreeing on a shared goal rather than jumping into analysis, which might then be, as you just said, be hijacked by a partisan group who just basically furthers its own benefit.
Yes, which brings me to my final question. In your experience of nearly 2 decades in this field, what is the consensus in the scientific community? Because you still see, like in America, Ted Cruz, and the entire Republican contingent flat out denied climate change. And they even said things like there's no warming has been detected in the last 2 decades, and even had actual scientists say things. So how do you feel about that?
I think it's a deeply cultural issue. And I think when you work in science, in natural science, for example, you start to almost embody or kind of live up to a certain notion of what a scientific understanding means. It means that you establish some of the facts, you have a very systematic approach to look at things and try to put them into context and develop your theory.
Yes.
So in that sense, you're close to these issues. And then you start to understand it's hard to reject a hypothesis based on this data. Now, many of the critics, they do not come from such an understanding of what science means. For them, it's basically, I wouldn't say uneducated, but sometimes you get a bit to that level to say, and you've seen it in the last presidential election. You can basically, in some constituencies, some communities, you can basically say whatever you want, and it's not checked against. And you can play on that. You can build on that notion that people do not, in fact, check the facts, especially if checking the facts has some consequences in the sense, I might have to change something in my life.
Yes.
And then it's tremendously more easy to reject even the facts until they hit home. And so what you've seen in this debate, in the early days, it was a debate, there's no change happening. Now, some of the change is so obvious It's hard to say there's nothing changing,
Yes.
but then you can still forever and endlessly argue has nothing to do with my own action, whatever that might be. Even that statement over time will sometimes be impossible to make,
Yes.
because it will be so obvious, and it is obvious to them, to those who study the system. But again, back to my first comment is that science is interested in understanding a system in an almost, not really, but in trying to be as non-normative as possible. So as independently as possible establish these facts. That's the scientific part of the story.
Yes.
But if you then are on a political leaders level, you might have an exactly opposite interest.
Yes.
To basically only look at the things that play to your strength, and to try to play down, ignore, or ridicule everything that doesn't fit your worldview. And we would never claim that being science.
Yes.
And so there will always be that conflict and that clash. And the only point science can make is just to basically stick to that rigor and try to convince. There's not much more that you can do. And over time, you know that these things will sort out. The bad thing is we don't have so much time for that. So
Yes.
there will be unnecessary suffering we could have avoided, but we can't. As our institutional structures, the way we govern and lead, do sometimes not allow that insight to be translated into action. And that's a bit sad, but keep pushing.
Yes.
What else we can do?
Yes. So, what do you recommend to an upcoming student, a physicist, or an earth science student, or just a student in general? What should he or she be looking to do, specifically on a more formal education level, to deal with the problems the way you do?
I think it's a bit to my previous comment. I think do one thing very seriously and very deep, and really try. And it doesn't matter what field you study,
All right.
but do that properly. I think you need this kind of very strong foothold to later play. So if you study social science, do it well. So later you have a chance to deeply engage in a dialogue with a physicist,
Yes.
and how these models can be used in decision making. Or the other way around, if you study more the natural science side, do it so well, you basically are able to talk not with formula, but in a kind of in a general language fashion with, say, a social scientist to make it happen.
Yes.
And I felt in my own case it was a good idea, because it just came about by chance, to do one thing first and seriously at a time, and then start to venture out and to test your worldview and try to especially understand why things are perceived by different people in a different fashion in their own right, and you're probably in dialogue get much further. But yeah, one thing first and seriously is definitely the best investment.
Yes.
And then try to kind of open up as far as you can, right?
Well, that was very enlightening and very interesting. Got to learn a lot of new things. I hope everyone listening to this has something to take away from it. Thank you so much, Dr. Bresch, for joining us today. We hope to maybe get you on again to discuss some other topic.
Thanks, pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you liked it, we'd really appreciate it if you shared it and gave us your feedback. We publish a new episode every week. For more details, visit our website simplifyd.xyz.